Edwin Sutherland's theory of differential association posits that people learn to engage in criminal behavior the same way that they learn in other types. Edwin Sutherland's theory of differential association posits that Edwin Sutherland is the one that is initially responsible for crafting the theory of differential association. And in a later version, he would add his student, Donald Cressy, to that paper as well. But it's really his work. And this theory of differential association posits that people learn to engage in criminal behavior the same way that they learn other types of non-criminal behaviors. In many respects, learning theories stand in contrast to theories which argue that social class or broken homes, race, or age, among other variables, lead to crime. While there are both micro and macro learning theories, Sutherland's theory of differential association is definitely a micro level theory which has had a tremendous amount of influence on crime research, and even today it still remains a dominant theory of crime. Again, this theory, Sutherland was initially the sole author, and then he added his student, Donald Cressy, to this, who is also a famous criminologist in his own right. But it essentially has 9 propositions. First, it asserts that criminal behavior is learned rather than inherited. In many respects, then, this contradicts individual trait-based theories of crime. In fact, Sutherland declared that criminal behavior is not inherited biologically or otherwise the result of any biological traits. And he also asserts that criminal behavior is learned in interaction with other persons in the process of communication. Sutherland also emphasizes that this communication can be verbal or nonverbal and may include actions such as gestures. He also contends that the learning of criminal behavior tends to occur in intimate personal groups. This is important because he would argue that impersonal agencies such as newspapers, movies, and television play very little importance in socializing criminals. Rather, socialization, he would argue, must occur in an intimate group for it to truly have an effect. So remember that Sutherland asserted that people learn crime from others who they are close to emotionally. He implied that criminal behavior is not learned through the mass media. Of course, this theory was presented in 1947 as the final draft. So I think it would be very interesting to see what Sutherland would have to say. Would he reconsider this aspect of his theory if he were alive today? After all, the internet is an extremely powerful information tool which people literally have access to at all times in the palms of their hands because of cell phones. So it would be very interesting to see what he would have to say about this. Sutherland and later Cressy, in their updated theory of differential association, assert that when criminal behavior is learned, an individual will become intimately familiar with techniques of committing the crime, as well as the motives, drives, rationalizations, and attitudes. So, for example, a would-be criminal may learn to justify his or her criminal actions, and these justifications are learned from someone within an intimate group. Let's say, for example, that a teenager engaged in the crime of deer poaching. He or she may argue that deer are overpopulated, and by killing a deer illegally out of season, this actually helps the deer population sustain itself. So remember that according to Sutherland's differential association theory, The learning of criminal behavior involves not only mastering how to commit the crime, but also the adoption of deviant attitudes that justify committing it. Later, we're going to talk about Sykes and Matz's neutralization techniques. This will actually be in control theories of crime when we cover that later on in the course. But I also think that Sykes and Matz's neutralization techniques can also be considered a learning theory. But we will not cover it this week. But that'll be something to look forward to. Sutherland also asserts that the specific direction of motives and drives is learned from definitions of the legal code as either favorable or unfavorable. And he argues that individuals are surrounded by both those who define the legal code as rules to be observed, as well as those who have definitions favorable to the violation of the legal code. So in other words, gaining knowledge of criminal behavior also involves learning whether to define laws as worthy of obedience or as deserving of violation. Sutherland argues that a person becomes delinquent because of an excess of definitions favorable to the violation of the law over definitions unfavorable to the violation of the law. This is what he refers to as the principle of differential association, which refers to both criminal and anti-criminal associations and counteracting forces. He contends that people become criminal because of contacts with criminal patterns and isolation from anti-criminal patterns. I think this is really the heart of Sutherland's differential association theory. He essentially points out that people will break the law if they develop more law-breaking attitudes than law-abiding attitudes. Okay, let's now talk about the next proposition. In Proposition 7, Sutherland, and later writing with Cressy, contends that differential association may vary in the degree of frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. And you can see I've defined each of those terms as they're laid out in the Colon and Agnew book. By the term priority, Sutherland is referring to how early in life this contact occurs, where with the term intensity, he's referring to how respected or prestigious the source is. So, for example, if a young child was taught by his father that it is acceptable to hunt deer illegally during the off-season, there's a strong likelihood that this belief would persist into that child's adulthood. And I think it's very important to point out here that associations do not affect one's views equally. For example, police come into frequent contact with criminals, but they do not adopt these criminal attitudes. So remember that according to Sutherland, and later Sutherland writing with Cressy, the effects of associations vary according to the four dimensions that you see here on the screen. And now they're about to go away. Edwin Sutherland also contends that the process of learning criminal behavior by association with criminal and anti-criminal patterns involves all of the mechanisms that are involved in any other learning. And here he emphasizes that socialization into crime includes the same processes involved in socialization into law-abiding behavior. Finally, he asserts that criminal behavior is not explained solely by general needs and values, since non-criminal behavior is also an expression of the same needs and values. Simply put, Sutherland believed that motives are not sufficient to explain crime. For example, the desire for money motivates some people to get a good education and work hard. Similarly, jealousy may lead some people to commit murder, but most people who are jealous do not commit murder. Thus, other forces must also be at work. Even though Sutherland's theory is perhaps one of the most notable theories in the sociological study of crime, it nevertheless has received numerous criticisms over the year. For example, some scholars contend that he fails to fully describe the process by which crime is learned. He only says, according to some critics, that crime is the result of having more definitions favorable to the violation of the law than definitions unfavorable to the violation of the law. Ronald Akers actually made a very valiant attempt to address this shortcoming of Sutherland's work in his theory, a social learning theory of crime. Getting back to Sutherland, though, some critics point to difficulties in testing differential association theory. His emphasis on the number of definitions favorable and unfavorable to violating the law is fairly difficult to measure. Also, Sutherland and Cressy's focus, because remember Cressy published the last version of the theory with him, their focus was on male delinquency, and they did not fully consider whether differential association works the same for females. This is worth investigating, and it has been investigated since the publication of the theory, but it's worth looking at because girls often will have more intimate relationships with one another than boys. At the same time, however, their friends that they make are likely to be less delinquent and thus less likely to promote delinquency. Another criticism of this theory, I think, is that many crimes are committed by lone individuals, which may not stem from attitudes and techniques learned from friends. For instance, most murders are committed by people acting alone, who cannot be said to have learned from their friends that it is acceptable to commit murder. And most rapes are also committed by lone offenders, who cannot be said to have learned attitudes approving rape from their friends. So differential association may not do a great job in explaining all crimes. I think it is very applicable, though, to juvenile crimes such as shoplifting, in which peer influences play an important role. But still, it is probably less applicable to crimes such as homicide or rape. Still, aside from these criticisms, differential association theory remains very important for calling attention to the influence of peers and learning on delinquency. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, notice that Sutherland and Cressy did not say much about the processes by which individuals adopt deviant attitudes through differential associations. As we will soon see, Ronald Akers, who is still an active criminologist today, I believe almost 99% sure he's at the University of Florida, we'll see that he attempted to explicitly discuss the learning process. And Akers would present a theory which was grounded in behavioral psychology and is still regarded as one of the leading theories of crime. So let's take a short break. I've spoken a little longer than I thought I was going to, but that's okay. And then we'll turn our attention to Akers among other, as well as other social learning theories of crime.